Thank you all for coming out. For those of you still getting food, feel free to come in whenever you can. Then we're probably just going to close those doors for sound. Thank you all for coming out. We're here to talk about Democracy in Chains with Nancy MacLean, the incredible author. If you haven't had a chance to read this book, it's absolutely incredible. My name is Justice Gaines. I'm an organizer with Jobs with Justice. We want to say thank you to the Brown Department of History who helped set up this event and got us that food out there from Machu Picchu. And thank you all for coming out. We're excited to have a good conversation. Yes, and then would you like me to introduce you? Sure. Cool. So with us is Nancy MacLean. Nancy MacLean is the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. She's the author of Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace, and 2 books for course use, The American Women's Movement, 1945 to 2000, A Brief History with Documents in Debating the American Conservative Movement, 1945 to the present, with Donald C. Critchlow. Her scholarship has received more than a dozen prizes and awards and has been supported by fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for Humanities, the National Humanities Center, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowships Foundation. Her most recent book, about which she will speak, is Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Booklist called it, perhaps the best explanation to date of the roots of the political divide that threatens to irrevocably alter American government. The Guardian said, it is a missing chapter, a key to understanding the politics of the past half century. Democracy in Change has been long listed for the National Book Award. So please welcome Nancy MacLean. And so I'm so excited to have you, and thank you for coming. Thank you to the History Department for helping us set this up. And I guess before we necessarily get into it, I guess how did you get into this work?
So I have never heard. Thank you, Justice, for being my host and interviewer here. This is really great, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I know how busy people are, and I know it's taken a lot to come out on a weeknight like this. So thank you for coming. So I had never heard of Charles Koch when I started the research that became this book, or this guy, James McGill Buchanan, who's another featured figure in the book, when I started working on this, and that was in 2006, and I actually got into it from the story of Virginia, the state of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Ed and school desegregation, and the first kind of entree I had to this topic was the story of Prince Edward County, Virginia, where county officials responded to first 100% solid high school student strike for a decent school in 1951, which we would know a lot more about if television had existed then, but it was a pretty amazing strike brought together by this female student and her favorite teacher, and just an amazing story. And that strike led to Prince Edward County being one of the cases that was folded into the Brown versus Board of Education decision, protesting segregated and inferior schools. Well, fast forward, the plaintiffs won in the Brown case, and the court, of course, said that there shouldn't be segregated public schools, but Virginia officials responded to that by essentially threatening public education and supporting a system of state-provided vouchers so that people could go off to segregation academies, passing legislation to close any school that desegregated. So in this case of Prince Edward County in 1959, the county officials shut down the public school entirely for 5 years, and all the white kids went off to private segregation academies with public tuition grants, and all the black kids were left with no formal education whatsoever until 1964, when the courts intervened and forced them to reopen the system. So that's a long-winded way of saying that that was really my focus, but as I was doing that, I found out that these ultra-free market economists, including Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago, and these 2 guys I had never heard of at the University of Virginia, got involved, essentially making a case that the state of Virginia should privatize. its public schools. So parents could send their kids to whatever kind of school white parents could send their kids to whatever kind of school they wanted. And so I just got really intrigued because that story had, the story of Virginia's massive resistance had been told, but it had been told as kind of the last gasp of the Jim Crow system. And when I saw the role of these economists, I realized really it was the first loud shout of neoliberalism, and a story that nobody had really uncovered, because we tend to think of these things in their different silos. So anyway, I got on the trail of this Buchanan guy, and one thing led to another.
Awesome, thank you. And so for this, folks of you who haven't read this book yet, please do. It's incredibly well written. I was kind of blown away. I was like, oh wow, look at this. And even the start of really looking at what our current government structure is and the corporate influence of our government structure. We think about citizens, and a lot of us have heard about the Koch brothers, but then you found this guy, James McGill Buchanan, and sort of his influence as maybe even close to as important as the Koch brothers.
Yeah, the way I think about it is that Koch supplied the money, but he didn't have a strategy, right? And so it's from Buchanan that Koch gets the strategy, the ideas that make the money effective. And so in my research, I learned that Charles Koch, and we know like many other great journalists, Jane Mayer, leading among them, has followed the money trail on the Kochs and shown us something of how, it's been doled out and how it's being used in our politics and how it's funding organizations that are radically trying to change our institutions and society. But what I was able to find in looking at this guy Buchanan was what is the operational strategy that's guiding all of this and what is the end game. And so Charles Koch, by his own admission, when he started investing heavily in Buchanan Center at George Mason University, Koch said that he had been funding libertarian thinkers for 3 decades by then, in 1997, trying to find what he called the technology that would let them break through. And this is a man who has 3 engineering degrees from MIT. He's much smarter than I think a lot of critics have realized. But when he talks about technology, he's talking about ideas and strategy. And so it was from this guy Buchanan that he essentially got a set of ideas for taking down the liberal state, the 20th century government that citizen action has built up. So that, I think, is maybe the real contribution to this, to see what they're doing and why and how. And that includes trying to undermine collective organizations, particularly labor unions, and starting with public sector unions, particularly teachers' unions. And they will say that they're, doing things on behalf of students or whatever, but really they understand that teachers' unions are our biggest labor unions in contemporary America, and they're also really important lobbying forces for a whole variety of other progressive things that defend democratic government. And so the strategy on the right is to take them out as players, because then it's much easier to get to everybody else. And that's just one piece of it. Other parts of this strategy involve the gerrymandering to misrepresent the will of the voters that we've seen so much of, and there's actually a case before the Supreme Court now from North Carolina. Also, the voter suppression efforts, spreading this myth that any serious social science has shown is bogus. The notion that there's mass intentional voter fraud, no evidence for that, but they use that myth in order to keep from the polls people who would challenge this agenda. So that's another piece. Trying to privatize Social Security and Medicare without saying that's what they're doing, calling it reform when they're actually seeking to undercut it and eventually have us in a situation in which people would have private accounts, individual accounts, which would be invested with Wall Street, which has shown itself so responsible with our money in the past, right? So it's a quite systematic and very well thought out plan, if you want to call it that. But basically, the end game of it too is important to know, is changing the Constitution. So they are actually organizing in the states through groups also like the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of already. But through ALEC and allied Republican officials in state governments, they're lining up authorizations from state governments to hold a constitutional convention. So they now have 27 of the 34 states that would be needed to call a constitutional convention. The important thing to know is, A, we haven't had a constitutional convention ever since the document was created. That was the last constitutional convention. That's one thing to know. And then the second thing to know is that the Constitution provides rules in Section 5 for how you convene a convention. How the delegates get selected, how do they go in. But there's no rules for what happens once you have a convention. And one former law school dean was on a panel with me, hosting me at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and she pointed out that at such a convention, if they wanted to, they could revoke the Bill of Rights. Now, they don't. I don't think they want to do that, but they have 10 other things that they do want to do, including a balanced budget amendment, which sounds good on the face of it, but would ultimately undermine Social Security and Medicare because of the way that they're continuing appropriations, undermine regulation. They want to put voter ID into the national constitution, into the federal constitution. They actually want to go back to, they want to get rid of the 17th Amendment from the Progressive era that ended the indirect election of senators and let the people elect their own senators. That was adopted in the Progressive era because corporations were totally dominating state governments and people had enough of it, and so they went to direct election. But these people in ALEC and the Koch operations understand that they can most easily control state governments, and so that's what, and if they control the state governments and the state governments pick the senators, that's even more control over what the Senate does. So it is a really audacious plan that they have, and it's very, very strategic. So it was really chilling to me. I mean, sometimes I have told people, and it's true, I just sometimes felt nauseated as I was putting this together, and I would see yet another organization carrying out yet another piece of it, often with these people who had been trained at George Mason and this guy Buchanan's program.
And you sort of opened up the book, this was just a funny story, but you opened up the book saying that you kind of found all this information because you walked into an office that they forgot to lock, essentially. You walked into the building he was working in, all the paperwork was there. They just left it unguarded.
Yeah.
Which is funny.
It is funny. Yeah, it's a classic thing too, because so many of the academics who work with this, with the Kochs and try to advance their programs in the universities, they're typically economists or also legal scholars, and I don't think they have much respect for history. They can't, or they wouldn't be trying to push the model of society. They are, because it ended disastrously the last time we got the Great Depression and the battle between fascism and communism. It did not work out well. But, so they're not interested in history, and I think they just couldn't even imagine that these records would be important. Like, who would want old dirty paper stuck under, stairwells and, all this stuff that was all around. So they didn't pay any attention to it, and all the Koch people went off to this fancy new blast office building, this Mercatus Center that was closer to Washington, and they left this old house with all these records. So it was kind of fun for me because I'm an archive rat. So I just was able to go in and just go through everything and make a ton of copies and put the story together. So yeah, they're not really happy about it now. They wish they'd close the records.
And so you were outlining, and you outlined all throughout the book, including the title, right? Part of this whole operation is to diminish democracy, essentially to overpower, eliminate democracy as it stands. And one of the things that struck me about the book was sort of the reasoning behind this, or the words they're using. They're talking about freedom. They're talking about liberty, and that democracy is undermining liberty. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that sort of use of language, and that's really in their founding, not even a co-optation, but really in their founding, that they believe in economic liberty as the ultimate society.
Yeah, they do, and I think that's a really important issue to lift up, that the people who are extreme believers in economic liberty have long been hostile to democracy in America, and the classic case of that was John C. Calhoun, who was a senator from South Carolina in the early part of the 19th century. You might remember him from a high school history text. He's usually quoted as having said on the floor of the Senate that slavery is a positive good. But in addition to saying things like that, as a slaveholder himself, he also fancied himself a political scientist. He actually used that language of political science, and he wrote 2 long treatises on government, reinterpreting our Constitution and how America should work. And basically, it was this primal fear of democracy, that the slaveholding had become incredibly profitable thanks to the cotton gin. There were more millionaires in Mississippi than in New York City in 1860. And Calhoun understood that in the North, there were growing numbers of voters who were frowning on the system of slavery. You know, they might not have been anti-racist, but they didn't want to be in a country that was supporting slavery. And so that fear of democracy from the nation, and also even the fear of like the yeoman farmers who wanted roads and schools for their kids, like he saw that as an infringement on him, for his taxation and tax levels. And so he developed this theory of states' rights to basically restrict what the federal constitution and the federal government could do. And what's interesting about that is that tradition of Calhoun's thought was revived in Virginia in response to Brown versus Board of Education to fight the Supreme Court decision and to fight the federal government that had created the New Deal that was lifting labor standards and stuff. And so this guy Buchanan comes to Virginia just as Calhoun's thought is being exhumed from the grave to fight Brown, and he develops it into this Virginia School of Political Economy, as it was called. So that tension that you're pointing out to between, this extreme notion of economic liberty and popular democracy goes way back in our history, but also is the crux of what the Koch donor network is pushing today, is that they think that, you could say we the people, through labor unions, through our environmental groups, for feminist groups that push for family-friendly policies, civil rights groups that want action on discrimination. I mean, you could just go on and on, but they see all that as an infringement on their liberty as employers or as taxpayers, and so that's where a lot of this is coming from. But I think that the single most important finding in my book is that they're doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it because they understand that they are a permanent minority. And repeated experience, if you want, we could go into that, but I'll just say that repeated experiences have shown them that when the voters understand what this agenda is, people reject it. They don't want it. And that's why they're going by what I have called a stealth strategy to get this through. And Koch actually said when he gave his first huge contribution to George Mason, he said, since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. So basically what he's saying is that they are a minority movement, and if they don't fight in another way, they can't win. And so to me, that is actually, even though this whole thing is staggering and frightening in so many ways, that someone would have the audacity to do this, right? To try to remodel our society without telling us openly what they're doing. I think that fact that there is this latent majority that would oppose this can be tremendously empowering and should help us to see that a crucial task for us is to inform people about this, to help them understand what's going on, and then to organize people to try to stop this. And I think stopping it in today's world is also going to require having a positive agenda. So some of you probably know Naomi Klein, the writer who has a recent book called No Is Not Enough, and I think that's a beautiful slogan and a good way of capturing our situation right now, because her point is that, especially with Donald Trump and everything, yes, we can say no and we have to protest and stop things, but we also have to figure out a vision of what are we for, right? And what is a fair and just and sustainable society going forward. So there's a tremendous danger now, I think, and a tremendous threat, but there's also some real opportunity to create a better society going forward. And I think most of us know that we've been in trouble for a while now, and that's why, for example, Bernie Sanders did so well, because people understand that things are really messed up. So
yeah, no, and I think like what's so interesting too is this idea that they do know that they can't beat out the majority, so they have to find stealth ways. And I think talking a little bit more about how they were able to gain certain majorities, because in some ways they have been successful at propelling this stealth message that's helped them get someplace in power. But also some of the undercurrents too. You talk about how they targeted law schools, how they targeted economics departments, and how they sort of switched both law and economics to work in their favor, so that students were actually learning their doctrine. In some ways.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that. The Charles Koch Foundation, and that's only his, there are other donors that he works with, but they have now given monies to 400 universities around the country, and in some places they have these quite large centers, George Mason being the most famous, and that's exactly what they're trying to do, is change the disciplines of economics and of law to change, the way that our economy is understood and our nation's rule book is understood, and they're quite systematic about that and quite aggressive. They've also now gone into reaching high school teachers and creating organizations for high school's teachers where, it's like they have so much money, everything's sort of funded, so, people come for these training weekends and get this curriculum and are taught the curriculum and supplied with glossy materials. They're creating internships for young people at the college level, but now increasingly at the high school level as well. So there is there's like a motion picture institute now. There's a really concentrated effort to change the culture. And at some level, I have to say, on some of that, if they were just trying to change ideas, I don't like their ideas, and I don't agree with their ideas, and I think they would create an utterly unsustainable society, but I teach the history of social movements, everybody has a right to argue for their views and present their grievances and see if they can persuade people, but what's so troubling about this is there's an abuse of power even in the effort to change ideas. So when they contribute to campuses, they make donor agreements that are unlike any other donor agreements. For example, at Florida State, they even had cooperatives deciding which topics their students could research, like their master's and PhD students. Like, that is not normal. That should set off red alarm bells for any university administrator. So I can say a really positive thing about that is that there's an amazing group of young people who are working on this. They're Uncoke My Campus with a K, and they have a great website full of wonderful, useful information. So I encourage everybody to go to that site and learn about this, because they are actually the only group in the country whose full-time job is to fight the Koch influence. So that's good to know. Uncoke My Campus. I hope you'll check them out. I'm also trying to fundraise for them.
What's that website called?
If you just Google Uncoke My Campus, you'll find them. And they're just, I can't say enough good things about these young people. I went to what they call the convergence of a national grouping of them, and I kind of felt like, wow, is this like the founding of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? Because they were just so thoughtful and intersectional and bright and committed, and they were just really, really special. So I'm totally into them. But on the question of the stealth approach, I almost already mentioned some of the stuff like the gerrymandering and the voter suppression. But two other things to know about to get a sense of how again, strategic and cynical it is. I talk about in one chapter in the book, in the early 1980s, after Chile, under the dictatorship, privatized its social security system so that everybody had to go get, instead of having your social security account, you got an individual account with their financial sector, the equivalent of our Wall Street, which then went on to gouge people on the fees, and then did like our financial sector, behaved badly, so lots of people lost their life savings. So that happened later. But that was in 1979 that they privatized their system. In the beginning of the 1980s, Charles Koch's Cato Institute made Social Security privatization its top priority. They're still pushing for it, and they actually hired Pinochet's Minister of Labor, who implemented theirs to run the effort in the U.S. and advise other nations. Anyway, Buchanan in 1983 advised them on how to get this radical Social Security privatization. And he started out by saying that, and he went through all the demographics. It's like basically there's nobody who wants to change Social Security. It's like neither rich nor poor, neither black nor brown nor white, neither male nor female, neither Rust Belt nor Sun Belt, just any category you could imagine. He's like, no support for this. So instead of doing what most of us would do and say, golly, it's a good program, I guess we should leave it, maybe strengthen it, he said, so that means opposing it openly, frontally, would be political suicide. So then he proceeded from that basis to outline a strategy for how to essentially mislead people into Social Security privatization, beginning with misinforming them to think the system was insolvent. And how many of those commercials have you said saying Social Security won't be here, don't rely on it, blah, blah, that would be insolvent, and then like a multi-step program to break up the coalition supporting Social Security. And I don't know if you want me to go into the weeds on that, but just very, very cynical, like targeting particular groups to say how you could get older people, for example, who are already receiving Social Security or about to get them out of the fight because they'll pay the most attention and you need them out of the fight. And then other groups he targeted, and then the last one, the one that was most kind of breathtaking to me, was young people. So they specifically target young people to say, that you're providing a tremendous welfare subsidy for the aged, was the language used. And so they even have a group now called Generation Opportunity that targets young people, that tries to turn young people against the Social Security system and get them to support these private individual accounts. So it's really, you know, again, it's very, very calculated and it's very strategic. And they also understand that Social Security is the keystone of the American welfare state. You know, it's the most popular program, it's the most successful, it's the most long-lasting. So if you pull out that keystone.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because I feel like a lot of these arguments are so mainstream and widespread now. Because I know, and when I was in high school, one of the arguments that like my conservative high school friends would say is, Social Security won't even be around, so why would we support it now, right? It won't be around for us. We're paying into it, but we won't get the benefit from it. So, and that argument came out of the strategy.
Yes.
And you see it too with even Obamacare, right? Part of the reason the Republicans have not been able to repeal it is because their voters actually like a lot of the provisions when they're actually told the truth about them. And so it's interesting how all of these strategies kind of seem to stem from Buchanan's vision of economic liberty.
Yeah. There's another really good website and group to know about is Social Security Works, it's called. So it's kind of like a double entendre or whatever. But and they also have a book by that title. Some of the people who work there, but they combat this mythology about Social Security and explain what's needed to shore it up, but also expose that there's been this long campaign by the extremely wealthy to undermine it. And you know, it's also, you know, with some of these things, you have to think, okay, so where is the money going to go, or who's the other constituencies for this? And part of the reason I think that we have the problem that we do is because we've allowed inequality in our society to develop to such, frankly, obscene levels, so that we have these multi-billionaires like the Kochs who are hostile to our democratic institutions, who probably don't have any equal relationships with fellow citizens because they're so wealthy. And where was I going with that? What was the question?
Oh, just, you know, all of these, how they got these mainstream arguments into.
Right.
And then
sometimes I get tired. I've been on the road a lot. I was thinking about something like that. I don't know, it just escaped me.
No.
It'll come back.
But yeah, and so one of the big targets is Social Security as the crux of the welfare system.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. Sorry.
Okay.
But so this wealth, some of the wealth, of course, is hedge fund managers, you know, which is a job category, occupation that like didn't really exist. Who had heard of a hedge fund manager like when I started school or others did? But now it's a huge section of the economy, the financial sector, and the people who do this investing. And so they are looking at all of these big piles of government money and thinking, whoop, can't wait to get our hands on that. You know, so I think it's something like $800 billion that are in public education. And so now there's something called the Education Industry Investment Forum, right? Where these guys are like talking about how do we crack open this industry and make it for profit and make profit from it. And so the same thing is true also of people's retirement savings and other kinds of savings, that if you push government out of the way, who's it going to go to? Financial firms, and that would be a huge new source of profit for them.
Yeah, and I was actually about to go into education, so it's beautiful, because that's the other thing that's been a consistent, well, they've been attacking it since the beginning. That was Buchanan's first issue, was public education. And sort of one thing I thought was really interesting was the way they described public education and students and faculty's role specifically as being sort of essentially leeches of the system, right? They don't, with public education, they're not paying into it.
Particularly higher education.
So they're not paying as much or they're not paying their full price, so they're not invested in it, was the argument. And so it gave them a lot of range to protest. And so part of the strategy was how do we get students to stop protesting, and that was corporatizing private universities. And that kind of goes into this current situation with elementary universities too, and with DeVos and sort of trying to extend charter schools and private schools and religious institutions. And I don't know if you've been thinking a lot about that, and if how that relates to this whole strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So this economic libertarian cause, it has cast a jaundiced eye on public education for years now. I think it seemed to have started after the New Deal, and I think partly what happened is a lot of these very wealthy people found their kids coming home and supporting labor unions, saying they supported labor unions, and they wanted to build a welfare state, and they thought Social Security was great, and they said, what? And they became convinced that public education was this source of subversion, and it must be all filled with communists, because otherwise how could these kids come out with these crazy thoughts? And so some of the hostility to public education goes further back, but in the 1950s with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, then it got this kind of mass constituent. Before it was kind of like literally just hundreds of quirky libertarians. But in the 1950s, it begins to get this mass base with the racial animus that they were able to tap into in the fight against Brown. And then this guy Buchanan, and like many other people on the right, was very unhappy with the student movements of the 1960s, both the Black Freedom Movement and then the anti-war movement. And he was furious at that. And he produced this, it was an academic book, but also kind of a manifesto in 1969 that basically has the blueprint for today's attack on public higher education. So as Justice was just saying, he had this whole economic analysis of where the campus revolts came from, because he couldn't possibly believe that people could have really been concerned about racism before the war in Vietnam. Why did that happen? It must be something else. So he came up with this vision for how to transform the university, and it included that people must be made to pay full cost tuition, right? That you shouldn't have the kinds of subsidized tuition that, like, my generation, my husband, all the people who went through school in the 60s, you could go to college for like $100 a semester, not much. And that's how we built a broad middle class in those years. And as anybody who's young here knows, it's not like that now, right? So full cost tuition is their dream for public higher education, ending faculty governance, right? Restoring control, to having managers, having like the administrations manage people like they do in the private sector, and other things like that. And what you see now is that in all of these, there's 30 states now that are controlled by this radicalized Republican Party. Many of them are applying that program to public higher education with really devastating results. So actually that's another resource for people who are interested in public higher education. There's a great documentary called Starving the Beast that looks at a number of the states where this has happened. Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, Wisconsin, and I can't remember if California's in there. But anyway, so there's also a lot of good exposure of this stuff. But yeah, very radical program for public higher education, which, how many people here are dealing with student loans?
What's his name in the title again?
The documentary title?
Of 1969.
Oh, it was called Academia in Anarchy. I talk about it in one of the chapters here. Yeah. So students, loans, yeah. So imagine paying full cost tuition, not just partial cost. And it's also, some of this stuff is so cruel. One of the things they tried to push through in North Carolina was to send to parents, all parents, kind of a letter basically saying, like, if you were paying full tuition and you're, if you could afford full tuitions at the state university system, and you were paying that, to tell you how much extra you were paying for the people who weren't paying full tuition, right? So like a public shaming thing and an agitational device to turn some parents against, the children of other parents. So, part of the reason I feel so urgent about this, and I'm trying to speak wherever I can, is that I really sincerely believe that these guys are, and it's almost entirely men, you won't be surprised, and almost entirely white, no insults to the men here, but these are a particular kind of right-wing men. But they have this, what has now become a very rigid dogma, that they're pushing. Oh, and we could talk about climate science denial, because that's a big part of this. But they are pushing this rigid dogma, and it would ultimately result in an utterly unsustainable society. Right? I mean, it's just like, how could you live in a society like this? And I think one thing that's interesting too is that so many women respond to this and just say like, what? How could you do that? I think, that's because historically and in current terms, women do so much of the unpaid care work in our society, and and already women are feeling what some people call the care crisis for that plus wage earning. It's breaking a lot of people. But imagine if you lived in a society where not only are you doing what you're currently doing, but you're also going to have to take in your elderly relatives because they're not going to have Medicaid. Your kids aren't going to be able to have the support they would have in their public schools. We won't have so many of the things that we kind of take for granted now. So it's really a stark vision.
And also on that care crisis, we are launching our campaign to initiate rodent care here in Rhode Island, Jobs and Justice, to kind of combat that. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that at the end. On 2 notes on that too, I think what was interesting was in the book, part of the idea, it wasn't necessarily as it's deeply explained why there's this animus towards the feminist movement, except that they're more socialistic.
Yeah.
So it's not even like, oh, we hate women, it's like, y'all care too much about other people.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the issue. And then also with education, a note too, so I was on the budget committee at Brown, and one thing to know is that private universities, because of the market, actually subsidize their own tuition. So if you actually look at the cost of a student at Brown, it's closer to $99,000. And their tuition is about $60,000. And under sort of this vision, they would want people to be paying $99,000 for a year at an institution. So they want to even probably beyond what's already being pseudo-subsidized by the institutions themselves for the market purposes.
I'm not quite sure that they would say that just because Brown is a private institution, and private institutions, I think that would go with their vision of economic liberty, could decide to do whatever they wanted to. But definitely public institutions, they would want to see people paying what Buchanan called full cost tuition, meaning tuition that covers every element of the enterprise. Do you want to open up to, or do you like to
well, one thing I did want to asked about too is that you're very unapologetic in naming it as the radical right, and being very clear. And so I guess the 2 questions I had when I was reading that too is one, what is the left's role in this? Because we see that the Democratic Party has a lot of corporate interests, especially after this election. There was a lot of strain there, and there's a lot of pushback even within the left towards the Democratic Party. And also, they in the book you talk about how they're not necessarily conservatives, they're more libertarians. So what made the GOP more susceptible to this influence than maybe the Democratic Party, and being able for them to be able to infiltrate it the way they have? The Kochs have no sentimental love for the Republican Party.
For them it's just a delivery vehicle. It's the most easily controllable and co-optable for this agenda, and that also was the result of a learning experience where they realized, again, they're not even going to get 10% of Americans to support a libertarian program if they're honest about it. I mean, the Libertarian Party, I think, is can't even remember what its numbers are, but it's pretty low. And so they realized they'd have to go through a major party. The Democratic Party, for all its faults, is still the party of labor unions, the party of, the New Deal, the party of the Great Society and civil rights, so it was much less co-optable. So that was kind of their strategy. But it is also important to realize that what they've done to the Republican Party also comes from this Buchananite set of ideas that I've described. Buchanan always said that if you wanted to achieve radical change, actually the left could learn from this too, but if you wanted to achieve radical change, you needed to stop focusing on who rules and think about the rules. And stop thinking about just changing who rules, but think about changing the rules. And so his point was that if you have a given system of incentives and prohibitions, that's going to lead people to do certain things. For example, you all won't believe this, but they thought Ronald Reagan was a failure, that he didn't do nearly what they wanted done. really what they wanted done. They wanted much more radical change. But Reagan backed up from the brink, even in after his first budget in 1981, because he realized that to do what these guys wanted would be mortal warfare against Social Security, veterans, farmers, basically core elements of their constituency. So the Koch team learned from this that they had to remake the Republican Party. Like, how do you keep this party, don't alarm people, but make it behave very differently? And what they learned was that they could use the threat of primary challenges. And, keep in mind how many new verbs we're getting in all this, right? Like, until recently, like probably 2010 or so, we didn't even have this verb we now have, to be primaried. Well, now almost every Republican office holder, now Dianne Feinstein too, is afraid of being primaried, because what they'll do if you don't carry the full Koch agenda is they will put in a ton of money into negative advertising against you and get somebody to run against you from the right. And in many cases, those people have won. And where they haven't won, they've at least put fear into the existing Republicans. So Orrin Hatch protested against these guys, John McCain, other people, but in the end, Orrin Hatch, toed the line and didn't let Obama have his judicial nominee. McCain backed up on climate science, climate change and stuff, so they've been very effective. Just a simple metric to give you a sense of how effective these primary threats are, and the cash rewards essentially for people who do toe the line. In the early 1990s, there was no, according to environmental scholars that I've talked with and read, there was no difference between the two parties in their understanding that climate change was happening and that it was man-made. And they would have, of course, the kind of differences Republicans and Democrats have over how you deal with that, but there was no difference on the fact of it. By 2014, thanks to this threat of primary challenges and this pressure from these arch-right wealthy donors, only 8 of 278 Republicans in Congress will admit that climate change is man-made and is a threat to us. Like, that is really stunning. And that, I think, is also an indicator of what I'm saying about how this set of ideas, which once may have seemed idealistic to some people, has calcified into this rigid dogma that is literally, I believe, deadly. If you think about what just happened in the hurricanes, in Harvey and Irma and these other cases where obviously like a hurricane happens, but all the climate scientists are saying they're made much worse by global warming, by climate change. And you have this cause that is actually funding organizations and individuals to mislead the public about climate science and to say that it is not what it is, and to actually defame individual climate scientists as well, to try to discredit them. So that, to me, is an indicator of, again, just how dangerous this enterprise is and why we need to pay attention, because there's just systematic efforts to just put smog in our political universe so that people don't see this. And actually, one of the good environmental blogs is called Desmog blog. So, appreciation of them, I've started to use this word smog, but I think that is what it is. It's just trying to cloud things so that people don't understand what's going on. And also, it's sad, but it has been effective. I forget the exact numbers that are in the book, but at one point before they started doing this in earnest among the population, there was deep concern about global warming and a desire to act on it. And now those numbers have dropped too, because people have been confused and led to think that this is more controversial, it's not as urgent a threat, when in fact it really is.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting to see, I think the numbers you showed, how many people supported climate change in the 90s, and even in 2007 compared to now. The electorate, it was around 7% in 2007, and now it's about 44, I believe, with the numbers you had.
Exactly, so it's no longer salient. You don't have to worry about it if you're an electorate.
Yeah, and I think one of the funny parts of the book was Trump really threw everyone for a loop, including the Koch brothers. And you have a line where they didn't prepare for Trump, right? Trump came in talking about we should get rid of NAFTA and all of these things that they actually really supported. And so I'm wondering, in this current climate where we hear about him doing something foolish every day, he's, you know, putting a lot of policies in danger. He's done a lot of actual damage. He's also been, you know, not effective in some ways. How does he or his administration, because we talked about the boss, being more on the end of the Koch brothers' agenda, but whereas Trump is kind of a wild card. So what does his administration mean for their agenda coming to power?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I anymore believe so much that he was the wild card that he was at the time he was elected, because I think he misled his own voters too, you know? I mean, he called the Koch people puppets, if you remember that. He said they're all puppets. I don't need anybody else's money. I have my own. I can't be bought. You know, and he said all the ugly, bigoted, and other things, you know, bullying things he said. But he said those things, and I think there were a lot of Republicans who also understood something was wrong. You know, there was all this money and all this stuff going on, and these Koch guys and everything, and so Donald Trump made it sound like he was the only Republican they could vote for and not get this Koch medicine. But now, since he came into office, whatever the situation was before, the reality is that most of his senior appointments come out of the Koch donor network. Actually, Jane Mayer just has a really great piece I was reading last night on Mike Pence, the vice president, and how deeply rooted he is in this network. That's true of DeVos, that's true of Scott Pruitt at the EPA, that's true of, I mean, it just goes on and on and on with his key people. And if you look at the agenda that they're pushing, it's very much the Koch agenda. You know, I mean, Donald Trump told voters, you know, and I mean, most people knew it was bogus at the time, but he said, you know, they were going to get rid of Obamacare, which they had made so, you know, odious, and he said he was going to bring something better, right? That better and cheaper, and you'd have more, and la-di-da-di-da, and now they've got nothing. And he's sabotaging the insurance markets in a way that's going to crush working class people, many of them in red states. So it's a really, really cynical operation, but they are pushing hard for radical changes in virtually every federal department and agency, as in the courts and the states controlled by them. So what I'm saying in a lot of these conversations with people is, I do believe this man is the distractor in chief, right? I mean, we know he's a con man. He's doing this over here with the fancy, sparkly objects, and we're all going like this while our pockets are being emptied over here. So my advice is to do a timeout Trump, right? The man needs a timeout, as any parent could say. But also, I think it's important because he has transfixed people, right? And he has monopolized the public conversation and sucked up all the air in the room. So we're not talking about all the things we should be talking about. So try this. Take a week and just promise yourself, don't be distracted. Don't do it. First of all, it's going to make you feel better. You won't be sick, you know, you won't be as agitated. Ignore all of the stuff about his tweets. Ignore everything he says publicly. Ignore all the articles that lead with him. And instead, focus on what's going on in your state. Focus on what's going on in these federal agencies. Look at what's happening in the courts and see where the things you care about seem most at issue and in danger, and then focus on doing something about that. Because I think a lot of us are just chasing our tails and getting ourselves, you know, into bad headspace by focusing on him, when in fact there's a lot that we need to be looking at and that we need to be doing if we're going to stop this train.
Yeah, and just on that note too, there's one court case that's kind of central to this too, that about gerrymandering and specifically whether it will be, they're going to be deciding whether it will be constitutional to purposely gerrymander a state to the point where the power of one party will be entrenched in perpetuity, which is what happened, and I believe it was Wisconsin.
There's a Wisconsin case, yeah, also North Carolina.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this earlier. The problem is gerrymandering is such an old 19th century word, and it's kind of ho-hum, and you know, people don't want to talk about it. But think about it, and Robert, over here, Robert said, why don't we think about it as a vote theft? Because that's what it is. It's people who are taking your vote and making your vote count for nothing. Because it's letting the legislators choose their voters rather than the voters choose their legislators, right? So in North Carolina, the parties are very evenly matched in terms of, in fact, we had an advantage in the number of votes for Congress, but they've so gerrymandered our districts that we have 11 Republicans and 3 Democrats, which is just insane. But the way that they did that was the way they drew the district line. So my own district in, well, it's Durham, but the way they drew it it, it goes all over. So it's been described as, in judicial filings, as a snowball hitting a windshield and melting. I mean, it's just insane, you know, the way they did that. But basically, they're drawing the lines to make sure that there aren't enough Democrats, and again, you know, I'm not partisan on this, you know, I'm not, like, I know there's a lot that Democrats have not done well, too, so it's not like I'm just saying this is Democrats versus Republicans, because I think this is much deeper, but the point is they're trying to make it so that voters who don't support their agenda will have lost their voices by drawing the districts in this way. So it's really, again, serious stuff that needs close attention.
Wow, so first of all, thank you. I want to open up to some questions from y'all soon, but I think like the one thing folks want to know as we're opening up to questions is sort of, where do we go from here? So,
okay.
I don't know if you want to answer that or if you want me to just pass it around and you can answer that.
I think why don't we bring some questions and ideas on the floor, because I will say too, you know, I'm a historian and I have a diagnosis of how we got here, and one of my favorite letters from a reader was someone who was a public health nurse, and she said, you know, in public health, we say you have to get the diagnosis right before you can figure out the treatment plan that will work. And so I feel like as a historian and researcher, I was able to come up with the diagnosis, but I have ideas, but I don't represent anybody. I don't have the magic solution to this. You know, I think I can say, hey, this is really serious and this is an all hands on deck moment for our democracy, but then I think it's something that people, you know, across the country need to figure out.
Any questions?
My question next is kind of related to that, so sorry. But it's interesting to talk about it as a diagnosis. I think that your job as a historian is very valuable in that way, and your book will serve as a tool for the next steps, possibly. So here's the diagnosis, like that chart that the doctor.
I hope so.
And I feel like I have a limited perspective in which I'm going to mention this through colleges, but
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
sorry. I'm sorry that I'm coming in as a little limited, as in I'm entering this question through the perspective of colleges, but I feel like it might serve towards larger things. I don't know if you heard lately, the Brown is just released, it's going to do something about free tuition. You see that?
They're trying to get loans.
Yeah, free loans or something. And so I've talked to older folks before about the problem of colleges and such, and sometimes they just can't. They're just like, well, the need for colleges to supply more has gone up, and that's why the price has gone up. And I feel like I can't get into their mind, just like, we don't need all that stuff. And I feel like there's just so much just accumulation. And now the schools are backtracking. They're like, oh, okay, now we'll try to help out and maybe make it not so cheap. But they're not going out with the problem in that they're just they're paying for too much. They're giving too much that isn't necessary.
Yeah.
And I would definitely you could ask me the Brown University's person, you pay so much and you don't feel it. You don't feel it. You can see it in the fancy new chairs and the fancy cafeteria, but you don't see it in the classrooms. The money being spent actually on your education. You just feel like you're paying for a luxury hotel, basically.
Yeah.
So how do we go about reversing things and getting people to think about it in a way to reverse things? And it's really bringing people up to speed. And even just giving them the imagination that it is possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really important area that you've identified, and again, there's not an easy solution to that, because I think college has been turned into a kind of a consumer product, right? And students are thought about as customers, and they market to the, high-end customers in a lot of private universities, and so they're competing over things that, as you're saying, are non-essentials to education, I don't quite know to be honest, what to do about that. I've noticed it, I see it, and I think it comes out from this kind of model that I was talking about with Buchanan, where you see it as like an industry like any other, but I don't feel like I have a solution. I feel like I'm such a nerd. But here's another good resource about that. There's a book called The Great Mistake. I think the author's name is Christopher Newfield, but I was just reading it last week, and he's somebody who's in the California system, a faculty member who was also on the budget committee for many years, and he talks about just kind of what you're saying about how the nature of college has changed, and he also points out that higher administrators in public colleges and universities have really dropped the ball in not pushing back against this notion that that college is just something that benefits the individual that gets educated. You know, trying to make them understand that it's a public good that lifts up our whole society, as it did with the mass expansion of education in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So I think there's a lot of good people thinking about that issue, but it's a little less central to what I'm doing, just because I'm so focused on this issue of the effort to shackle democracy. But I think maybe that resource might be helpful.
So how would you recommend talking to people who don't seem to believe? I was just saying, how would you talk to people that don't seem to see any of the things you're seeing, or don't believe that things can be reversed?
But don't believe what?
That things can be reversed. They just want to try to fix what already is here. Like put a Band-Aid on it rather than actually going.
Right. Well, I think, again, I do think that knowledge is power, right? That understanding the scale of this and understanding the intentions of the people behind it, why they're doing what they're doing, that's really important to convey to people. And I think helping people understand that we all have a stake in this. This is an incredible danger, but I think it's also a real opportunity, as dangers often are, right? But that, for a long time, many people on the left have been feeling frustrated by the way we're in such silos, so that you'll often have like the environmental folks here and the labor folks here and the women's movement folks here, et cetera, et cetera. And what I see through this research is that this Koch donor network and all the organizations they fund, they're coming for all of us. No one is safe from this. Seriously, anybody who relies on the 20th century model of government, which means that government has the power to levy taxes, to support things that the people want, government has the ability to regulate, to stop discrimination, to save the environment, to do all these other things, all of those things are at risk. A national rule book, a constitution understood so that people can intervene in these ways, all of these things are at risk. So I think the crucial thing is for us to learn to talk to one another in new ways, to get beyond those silos and be able to reach out to people that sometimes we'll have difficult conversations with. But, for example, if there are people in our world who voted for Trump or supported the Tea Party, it's important for them to know that this cause that is backing both of those wants to privatize Social Security and Medicare and public education. And, there are ways to say that, I think, and to communicate to people about that, or to help people understand that, on the other side, like with working class people and unions, that in my state, in North Carolina, they have twice now used homophobia to move this Koch agenda. So once they did it with something called Amendment 1 to our, they wanted a constitutional amendment, or amendment to our Constitution to prevent same-sex marriage, to get their voters out to do all these other things that they would do in supporting those Republicans at the same time. And more recently, you might have heard of something called the Bathroom Bill, HB2, which prevented the city of Charlotte from having an anti-discrimination ordinance to protect transgender people from using the bathroom that corresponded to their current gender. And they made this an issue across the state, and they used the power of the state government to say to the city of Charlotte, no, you can't do that. This is an example of something that's going on around the country against progressive legislation. They call it preemption. They use their control of the state government to stop your local community from preventing discrimination, raising wages, even having plastic bag ordinances in some places in Texas. But so there too, I think, for struggling working class people who may not think that they have a stake in the dignity and citizenship rights of trans people, they need to understand that bathroom bill also contained measures to prevent any local community from raising wages, from raising the minimum wage and adopting living wages. So I think, if you see where I'm going, I think there's a lot of, if people, here's the other thing I would say. This cause absolutely depends on the culture war. Because again, there's that latent majority they're scared of, right? So the only way to get around that latent minority is to have us all screaming at each other for one reason or another. So I think that if we can kind of lower the temperature and begin to have conversations about the things that unite us without burying or ignoring the things that divide us, but learning how to talk about them calmly, I think a lot of headway could be made.
Does anyone else have other questions?
I have a few questions, but also one of those chances. So in my previous life, I worked at Progressive Latino and I worked on battling anti-immigration policy here in Rhode Island. And I did my own research, like in battling where information was coming from, because the far right here, including a lot of the Democrats, use a lot of outside information to try to sway policy in the State House. And in my own research, I found that the Heritage Foundation was seeming to be coordinating a lot of national groups, supposedly independent groups, but they also had some marching orders and local and regional groups with information. And the more I dug into them, the more I saw that they also not just had immigration on their plate, but also anti-labor and trickle-down economics with all the, what we have now is a lot of supposedly business and now analyst groups that are always ranking states and
Yes,
on the bottom, whatever, to try to get more trickle-down economics for them. I'm wondering, how does the Buchanan stuff and Alec and where's the Heritage Foundation? Because I didn't have the time to really get deeper than that. It seems like where does that all fit?
Yeah, really important. So Heritage is a really big player in this, and looking at Heritage can also show you how this cause has changed over time, because in the 1970s, Charles Koch was very insistent that his grantees remain radical. He said they should never compromise, and Cato actually had a pretty vigorous libertarian position on issues, meaning that, for example, they supported drug legalization, they supported legalized prostitution, they thought there should be no laws against sex among consenting adults in any, whatever people chose to do, and other kinds of, and now they also didn't think there should be a minimum wage. I don't want you to start thinking, all these people are great, but no minimum wages, no social security, all the rest of it, but definitely, pushing back against that social conservative agenda, which Heritage was aggressively pushing in the 1970s. Well, now, when you come up to the present, Koch and the donor network have become much more serious about winning power, and to do that, again, they know libertarianism isn't popular, so who's got the votes? Conservatives, right? So they have allied with the social conservatives, and Heritage is a great example of that and has a lot of Koch money now. And the other issue that you raised about the ranking of the states, this is also very Buchananite, and I wish I'd said more in the book. I kind of reduced it to a long footnote when I was under pressure to make the text shorter, but I do want to write more about this. But he actually started convening conferences in the early 90s for corporate people, CEOs, managers, and right-wing donors and foundations, and encouraging them to, because again, their ideas aren't popular, right? So how are they going to get what they want done? To employ, he called them actions on the spectrum of secession. So we're back with our friend John C. Calhoun again. Actions on the spectrum of secession to essentially engage in coercive bargaining to get states to do what they would not otherwise do. So these actions on the spectrum of secession include privatization, decentralization, devolution. I've been doing too much, I forgot to, but you get the gist of it. So basically what is happening there, what he was doing was driving this thing we call the race to the bottom. Okay, so a lot of us, when we talk about the race to the bottom now, you know, the plunging tax rates, the plunging services, the disinvestment in our schools, and all of these things, we think, well, that's an inevitable result of globalization, because there's all this competition, right? And so corporations, you know, they say they can't pay, and that's why we're having this. But what you see in that work that Buchanan was doing is he was tutoring them in this, right? And also, they were saying, you know, send your tax revenues off to the Cayman Islands, right? Lodge your money in the Cayman Islands so you don't have to pay U.S. taxes. You know, again, don't observe the Democratic majority, don't observe what the people want, but instead use the threat of exit as a club to get what you want. So that's why, and he also called this competitive federalism, which speaks to your point, that now they issue these ratings on states so that your state legislatures are supposed to say, oh, we're only the 13th most competitive state, you know, in a good business climate. Let's try to make ourselves the 7th most competitive state by cutting our taxes and slashing our public services and getting rid of regulations that people have fought for over many years and won. So yes, it is all very much connected, and these groups work closely together. And in an example of that, and this is another, speaks to the problem on the Democratic or the left side too, that the groups of that state policy network that I mentioned earlier, and you guys have one here, and I was just in Massachusetts, they have like 14. Or wait, was that, maybe that was Washington? No, that was Virginia. Yeah, sorry, Massachusetts has two, Washington has, Virginia has a ton. These state policy network groups are ostensibly separate, but they are forced as a condition of their grants to share their materials and best practices. They're forced to cooperate. Now contrast that with the left, where foundations have almost every progressive group in competition with another group, right? To say, how are you different? How are you distinct? You know, show us your results. So I think there's a lot on the left that can be learned from this too, to say that groups should be cooperating instead of competing, and that the funders, the foundation funders, need to understand this to realize that they should be helping people to work together rather than pitting them against one another.
So we might have time for one or two short questions.
I'd like to just address your suggestion of a cure, of engaging in conversation. You know, that's not very easily done nowadays. You have a long tradition of two topics you don't talk about, religion and politics, and you have people who don't have time to sit there. The art of conversation seems to have been lost. I'm not just making that personally. Books are written about the subject going alone. So that relying on person-to-person contact and conversation seems to me almost certainly doomed to ineffectiveness. Here we have like 20 people who showed up at something as important as this, and what you do is find yourself only speaking to people who already agree with your ideas. Engaging in a really persuasive conversation with someone whose ideas are opposed to yours, I find it very hard to arrange the time or the place or the partner to the conversation.
Well, I think you raised a very important point, and I never said it would be easy. But we also, you know, there are some things that are not easy but are essential, you know, and I'm glad that I teach the history of social movements because it keeps me kind of steady and it keeps me hopeful because I go back to other times. I mean, in the early 19th century when the abolition movement started, you know, they were treated as nuts, right? As pariahs. I mean, they were hounded by mobs. You know, religious people were hounded by mobs, and they were hounded by mobs. One book is called Gentlemen of Property and Standing, who said, who are you? How dare you say we can't practice slavery? It's in the Bible. These people are inferior. You need to learn, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, and now you try to talk to students about slavery, and they can't understand how it was ever accepted. So I think, you know, you start from where you are. You think about each one of us in this room knows people. You know, social movement organizers always say this, like do an inventory, think about resources. Who do you know? What networks are you part of? Do you belong to a church? Are you part of a civic group? Do you have a book group? Do you have, you know, people that you were in your occupation with in other states? Each one of us knows people that we could have easier conversations with if we tried to get them active, but we can also do things like canvassing. And I have a colleague who is actually religious about canvassing, who thinks it's like, I mean secular religious, but who thinks it is like a civic gift, and he loves it. I mean, he thrives on it because you have conversations, civic democratic conversations with strangers that you don't know, and you listen, and you hear what people care about, and you engage. And I mean, you know, I think social media has been great for a lot of things. It lets you know where events are being held and stuff, but real organizing, I believe, is done face-to-face in building relationships of trust and mutual accountability where people are going to come out, they're going to do what they said they were going to do, and they're going to take some joy in being with one another. And if it starts small, that's okay. I mean, a lot of important things in our history have started small, but it takes people saying, I believe in this, I value this, I think it's important, I'm going to act on it. And I'll tell you one other thing that may also help with people is this cause is counting us out. One of their top people, a guy named Tyler Cohen, who is at this Mercatus Center, who's been working with Charles Koch for 25 years on this stuff, is a popular writer, has a popular economics blog, he's written some best-selling books, and in one of them, he said, you know, people on the left and the Democrats and these other people, they keep saying, you know, people are going to revolt against all this, against the rising inequality and things that are happening. And he's like, I don't think so. They seem pretty happy with their Facebook and their Netflix and their iPhones, and they're pretty well distracted, and they seem pretty comfortable. And I think we should take that as a challenge. You know, every time we think, oh, I don't want to go out to that meeting, I don't want to make that phone call, I'd rather look at my Facebook. You know, I'd rather binge watch on Netflix. I mean, I do it too. We all do it. But I think when you say our democracy is hanging in the balance, the kind of world that we're going to bequeath to our children and to future generations is hanging in the balance. And there are people who are saying, we can do whatever we want to because these people aren't going to pay attention. They're going to play with their toys. Like, that gets me out of bed. It makes me think, you know, I want to do something. And maybe it won't be that way for everybody, but I think, you know, if enough people care and help to spread the message and take action on it, at least we have hope. Otherwise, you know, I don't know, I'm not a quitter.
Well, thank you for that. I think, you know,
Thank
whether
you.
it's canvassing we have to do or conversations we need to have or coordination that we need to get better at, we clearly have work to do. Thank you again so much
Thank
for
you
being
for coming
here.
out tonight.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Brown History Department.